In the spring of 1912, the North Atlantic stood as the world's busiest highway, a cold corridor between the old certainties of Europe and the raw promise of America. The great ships that crossed it, floating palaces of riveted steel and electric light, were not merely vessels but declarations. They proclaimed the mastery of human ingenuity over nature, the triumph of the industrial age, the invincibility of capital and engineering combined. To voyage aboard one was to participate in a ritual of modernity itself, to be suspended between continents and centuries, cocooned in luxury while the ancient ocean rolled beneath. The world into which the Titanic sailed was one of profound contradictions. It was the high summer of European empire, when a quarter of the globe answered to London, when the gold standard linked economies in a web of presumed permanence. Yet beneath the polished surface, fault lines deepened. Labor unrest convulsed the industrial cities. The arms race between Britain and Germany accelerated. The rigid hierarchies of class that had ordered society for generations faced mounting pressure from below. The Edwardian era, as it would be remembered, was an Indian summer, brilliant, fragile, and already touched by the shadow of coming storms. Technology had become the new religion. The wireless telegraph annihilated distance. Electric tramways transformed cities. The aeroplane, barely a decade old, promised to conquer the sky. And upon the seas, the great liners grew ever larger, ever more opulent, each new launch a fresh assertion that human beings had bent the elements to their will. Speed, size, luxury, these were the metrics of achievement, the proof that civilization had reached an unprecedented summit. Yet the ocean remembered its own laws. Cold and indifferent, it had swallowed ships for millennia, and it would swallow more. The Titanic, for all her splendor, was a steel shell moving through a realm governed not by boardrooms and blueprints, but by ice, current, and the absolute arithmetic of displacement and buoyancy. What happened in the early hours of April 15, 1912, was not simply a maritime disaster. It was a collision between the dream of the age and the reality that had never changed. The story begins not with a ship, but with a contest, a race for dominance on the most lucrative and prestigious sea route in the world. By the turn of the 20th century, the North Atlantic passenger trade had become a matter of national prestige as much as profit. The British shipping lines, once uncontested masters of the ocean, faced a formidable challenge from Germany, whose Hamburg America and Norddeutsche Lloyd companies operated vessels of astonishing speed and scale. In 1897, the German liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse claimed the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. British pride, intimately bound to maritime supremacy, felt the sting. Two companies dominated the British response. The Cunard Line, established and prestigious, secured government subsidies to construct two extraordinary vessels, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, launched in 1906 and 1907, respectively. Both ships were designed for velocity, their turbine engines driving them across the ocean at unprecedented speeds of 25 knots and beyond. They represented one philosophy of competition: to outrun the Germans, to reclaim the blue ribbon, to make the Atlantic crossing a race. The White Star Line, Cunard's historic rival, pursued a different strategy. Its chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, understood that not all passengers valued speed above comfort. The wealthiest travelers, the millionaires and industrialists who generated the most lucrative revenue, desired something else: absolute luxury, spaciousness, and a sense of serene grandeur. Ismay envisioned ships that would surpass anything afloat, not in speed, but in size and opulence. They would be floating hotels, offering amenities and comforts that rivaled the finest establishments on land. In 1907, Ismay met with Lord Purry, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipbuilding firm that had constructed every White Star vessel since 1871. The two men dined at Purry's London residence, and over the course of that evening, a plan crystallized. White Star would commission three sister ships of unprecedented dimensions, vessels so large that they would dwarf everything currently at sea. They would be named Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Each would measure over 880 feet in length and displace more than 45,000 tons. Their interiors would be designed by the finest architects and craftsmen. They would redefine transatlantic travel. The decision was also financial. In 1902, American financier J. Pierpont Morgan had acquired White Star as part of his International Mercantile Marine Company, a trust designed to consolidate North Atlantic shipping under American control. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, understood the symbolic and economic importance of maritime dominance. The Olympic-class ships would serve as flagships for his empire, advertisements for American capital's global reach, even as they sailed under the British flag and employed British crews. The design work fell to Thomas Andrews, Harland & Wolff's managing director and chief naval architect. Andrews, then in his mid-30s, was a man of exceptional technical skill and personal humility. He had apprenticed in the shipyard, working alongside riveters and platers, learning the craft from the inside. He possessed an engineer's precision and a craftsman's respect for detail. The Olympic-class ships would be his masterpiece. Andrews and his team faced extraordinary challenges. Ships of this scale had never been attempted. The hulls would require new construction techniques, new gantries, new methods of launching. The internal layout demanded innovation in everything from electrical systems to watertight subdivision. Andrews designed 16 compartments separated by 15 transverse bulkheads extending high into the hull. Watertight doors, operable from the bridge via electric switches, could seal these compartments in an emergency. The design calculations suggested that the ship could remain afloat even if the first 4 compartments were breached, a scenario considered beyond the realm of plausibility. The keel of the Olympic was laid in December 1908. The Titanic followed 3 months later, on March 31, 1909. The two ships rose side by side in Harland & Wolff's Belfast shipyard, monstrous iron skeletons attended by 15,000 men. The workforce represented a cross-section of Belfast's industrial proletariat: shipwrights and riveters, platers and carpenters, electricians and painters. They labored in conditions of considerable danger. The work was loud, filthy, and exhausting. Accidents were common. 8 men died during the Titanic's construction, their names recorded in shipyard ledgers but rarely mentioned in the promotional literature that celebrated the vessel's magnificence. The labor was also precise. Each rivet, more than 3 million in total, had to be heated, positioned, and hammered into place by teams working in perfect coordination. The steel plates, some weighing several tons, were hoisted into position by massive cranes and fixed to the frame with exacting tolerances. The result was a hull of extraordinary strength, its double bottom designed to withstand grounding, its subdivision intended to ensure survival even in a collision. The Olympic was launched on October 20, 1910, sliding into the waters of Belfast Lough before a crowd of 100,000 spectators. The Titanic's launch followed on May 31, 1911. No champagne bottle was broken across her bow. White Star did not practice that tradition. The hull simply descended the slipway, entering the water with a displacement wave that rocked the small boats in the harbor. The moment was both industrial routine and public spectacle, a statement of Belfast's manufacturing prowess and Britain's maritime might. Fitting out consumed another 10 months. The Titanic was towed to a deepwater dock where her engines, boilers, and interior fixtures would be installed. The engines alone were marvels: 2 massive reciprocating engines driving the wing propellers and a low-pressure turbine powered by exhaust steam driving the central propeller. Together, they could generate 46,000 horsepower. 29 boilers, containing 159 furnaces, fed by 600 tons of coal per day, supplied the steam. The engine rooms and boiler rooms, deep in the hull, were domains of heat and noise where the Black Gang, the stokers and trimmers, worked in shifts, shoveling coal into the roaring fires. While engineers attended to machinery, craftsmen transformed the superstructure into a vessel of extraordinary luxury. The first-class accommodations occupied the choicest sections of the ship: the upper decks, where promenades offered views of the sea, and the central axis, where motion was least pronounced. The grand staircase, perhaps the most celebrated feature, descended through 6 decks beneath a wrought iron and glass dome. Carved oak panels, gilded balustrades, and a large clock flanked by allegorical figures created an atmosphere of aristocratic splendor. First class also boasted a swimming pool, a squash court, a gymnasium equipped with the latest electric apparatus, and a Turkish bath decorated in elaborate Moorish style. The dining saloon could seat more than 500 passengers, its tables arranged beneath a ceiling of ornate plasterwork. A la carte restaurant offered an alternative, serving French cuisine at additional cost in a setting of Georgian elegance. A smoking room, paneled in mahogany and furnished with leather chairs, provided a masculine retreat. A reading and writing room, decorated in white with delicate furniture, catered to female passengers. Every space reflected the era's aesthetic preferences: historical pastiche, opulent materials, and an unabashed celebration of wealth. Second-class accommodations, often overlooked in popular accounts, equaled or surpassed first class on many older ships. The dining room featured long tables and substantial meals. Cabins were comfortable, if less spacious, and the public rooms, a smoking room, a library, offered genuine refinement. Second class attracted middle-class travelers, professionals, clergymen, academics, and prosperous tradesmen. They occupied an intermediate social stratum, neither plutocrats nor laborers, and the ship's architecture reflected that position. Third-class or steerage housed the emigrants, the great wave of humanity flowing from Europe to America in search of opportunity. These passengers, often entire families, carried their possessions in trunks and bundles. They slept in cabins with bunk beds, 6 or more to a room. The men's and women's quarters were strictly separated, dividing families for the duration of the voyage. The dining room was plain but clean, serving simple, hearty food. A general room provided space for socializing, and the deck areas accessible to third class, though limited, allowed fresh air and escape from the confinement below. The segregation of classes was absolute, enforced by locked gates and barriers. The ship was a vertical representation of Edwardian society, with privilege ascending toward light and air, while labor and poverty descended into the hull's depths. This arrangement was considered natural, even benevolent. The White Star Line prided itself on treating third-class passengers better than its competitors, providing cleanliness and adequate nutrition, a humanitarian gesture within the rigid framework of class hierarchy. Thomas Andrews, throughout the construction and fitting out, remained intimately involved. He walked the decks, checked fittings, consulted with workers, and recorded observations in his notebook. He noticed inadequacies, insufficient numbers of lifeboats, awkward placement of certain fixtures, design elements that might be improved. The ship, for all her magnificence, was not perfect, and Andrews knew it. Yet she was also a triumph, the culmination of a century's progress in naval architecture, and as the fitting out neared completion in early 1912, anticipation built. The Titanic departed Belfast on April 2, 1912, bound for Southampton. Thomas Andrews traveled aboard, accompanied by a team of Harland and Wolff's Guarantee Group, 9 men responsible for monitoring the ship's performance and addressing any mechanical or structural issues that emerged during the maiden voyage. The journey to Southampton was uneventful, a shakedown cruise through the Irish Sea and around the southern coast of England. The ship performed well. Her engines ran smoothly, her steering responded precisely, and she rode the gentle swells with stability. Southampton, on England's southern coast, served as White Star's primary departure point for transatlantic crossings. The docks bustled with activity as coal, provisions, luggage, and mail were loaded aboard. The coal strike that had paralyzed much of Britain's industry earlier in the spring created complications. Coal had to be transferred from other ships, including the Olympic, to ensure the Titanic had sufficient fuel for the crossing. The delay was minor, but it underscored the delicate logistics that sustained the great liners. Passengers began arriving on the morning of April 10. They came by train from London, by motorcar from country estates, by ferry across the Channel from France. The first-class passengers, boarding via the forward gangway, represented a striking cross-section of wealth and prominence. Among them was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, traveling with his young second wife, Madeline, who was pregnant. Astor, a member of the storied American dynasty, had spent the winter abroad following the scandal surrounding his divorce and remarriage. He was returning home, seeking to re-establish normalcy. Benjamin Guggenheim, another American millionaire, boarded with his mistress, the French singer Leontine Aubat, and his valet and chauffeur. Guggenheim, part of the mining and smelting fortune, maintained the fiction that Aubat was merely a traveling companion. The pretense reflected the era's social codes, which tolerated extramarital liaisons among the wealthy provided discretion was observed. Isidore and Ida Strauss, co-owners of Macy's department store in New York, traveled together as they always did. Isidore, in his mid-60s, had built his retail empire through shrewd management and innovation. Ida, his wife of more than 40 years, refused to travel without him. They were a devoted couple, and their presence aboard the Titanic was entirely ordinary, another crossing, another business obligation. Margaret Brown, a Denver socialite later mythologized as the unsinkable Molly Brown, boarded alone. She had been traveling in Europe and Egypt and was returning home early after receiving word of a family illness. Brown, self-made and energetic, did not belong to the old money elite, but had acquired wealth through her husband's mining success. She possessed a forceful personality and a sense of social mission that set her apart from many of her peers. Also in first class was J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, traveling on his company's flagship. Ismay's presence was both ceremonial and practical. He wished to observe the ship's performance and bask in the triumph of the maiden voyage. Accompanying him was Thomas Andrews, whose meticulous oversight continued even as the ship prepared to sail. Among the notable absentees was J. Pierpont Morgan himself. The financier had planned to travel aboard the Titanic, but cancelled at the last moment, citing business in Europe. His absence would later fuel conspiracy theories, though in truth, Morgan frequently altered his plans and thought nothing of missing a voyage. Second-class passengers boarded via a separate gangway. Among them was Lawrence Beasley, a British schoolmaster and science teacher traveling to visit his brother in Canada. Beasley, observant and articulate, would later write one of the most detailed survivor accounts, documenting the disaster with the precision of a trained mind. Also in second class was the Reverend Ernest Carter, returning to England from missionary work, and the Hart family, Benjamin, Esther, and their 7-year-old daughter Eva. Esther Hart, anxious about the voyage, had premonitions of disaster and resolved to stay awake each night, a decision that would save her life. Third-class passengers, more than 700 in total, represented a polyglot multitude: Scandinavians bound for Minnesota and the Dakotas, Irish families fleeing poverty for Boston and New York, Lebanese emigrants seeking new lives, their children clinging to unfamiliar toys, a group of young Swedish women traveling together, dreaming of America, a Chinese man, traveling alone, hoping to join relatives in New York. Their faces and names were rarely recorded in the press, their stories subsumed into collective categories: emigrants, steerage, the masses. The crew, numbering nearly 900, formed the ship's invisible foundation. They were divided into 3 departments: deck, engine, and victualling. The deck crew, under Captain Edward J. Smith, handled navigation and seamanship. Captain Smith, 62 years old, was White Star's senior commander, a veteran of 4 decades at sea. He had captained the Olympic on her maiden voyage and commanded her when she collided with HMS Hawke in Southampton Harbor the previous September, an incident that raised questions about the handling of such massive vessels in confined waters. Smith, known as the millionaire's captain for his popularity among wealthy passengers, projected calm authority. The maiden voyage of the Titanic would be his last command before retirement. The engineering crew, working in the depths of the ship, tended the engines and boilers. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell oversaw this department, managing a staff that included electricians, plumbers, and the Black Gang, the stokers and trimmers who shoveled coal into the furnaces. These men endured brutal conditions, temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, coal dust coating their lungs, the constant roar of machinery. They were paid poorly and regarded as the ship's lowest caste, yet the vessel's entire operation depended on their labor. The victualling crew, the largest department, served the passengers. Stewards and stewardesses attended to cabins, served meals, and responded to requests. Cooks and bakers prepared the food, working in kitchens that produced thousands of meals daily. The Ritz restaurant employed its own staff, operating semi-independently from the main dining saloon. Bellboys, porters, and lift operators facilitated movement through the ship's complex interior. The victualling crew was a microcosm of service labor, stratified by task and status, yet sharing the common experience of catering to the needs of others. At noon on April 10, the Titanic's whistles sounded, a deep bellow that echoed across Southampton Harbor. The mooring lines were cast off, and tugboats nudged the massive hull away from the dock. Slowly, the ship moved into the channel, her propellers churning the water. The departure nearly ended in disaster. As the Titanic passed the moored liner New York, the displacement of water caused by her bulk snapped the New York's mooring lines, and the smaller ship began drifting toward a collision. Quick action by the tugboats and Captain Smith's order to reverse engines averted the incident, but the near miss was unsettling. Some observers noted it as an inauspicious beginning. The Titanic proceeded down the Solent, crossed the English Channel, and arrived at Cherbourg, France by evening. Tenders ferried additional passengers and mail to the ship. Among those boarding were Margaret Brown and John Jacob Astor and his wife, who had traveled from Paris. After a brief stop, the ship departed for Queenstown, Ireland, arriving the next morning. Maori passengers, predominantly Irish emigrants, came aboard and sacks of mail were loaded. At 1:30 p.m. on April 11, the Titanic raised anchor and turned west, heading into the open Atlantic. The crossing began in excellent conditions. The sea was calm, the weather mild. The ship settled into a rhythm. Passengers explored the public rooms, promenaded on deck, and attended meals in the dining saloons. First class enjoyed elaborate dinners: oysters, consommé, poached salmon, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, roast duckling, elaborate desserts. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation ranged across business, politics, and society gossip. In second class, the meals were substantial if simpler, and the atmosphere was congenial, with passengers forming acquaintances across the tables. In third class, the food was plain but plentiful, and the general room became a venue for music and dancing, with passengers playing instruments and singing folk songs late into the evening. The ship's daily life revolved around routines. Stewards brought tea and biscuits to cabins in the morning. The gymnasium opened for passengers to try the electric horse and camel, novelty machines that simulated riding. The squash court was available for booking. The swimming pool, filled with seawater and heated, attracted bathers. The Turkish bath offered steam and relaxation. The Marconi room, staffed by 2 wireless operators, transmitted and received messages, a steady stream of personal communications, business transactions, and ice warnings from other ships. Beneath this surface calm, the ship was an industrial organism. In the boiler rooms, stokers worked 4-hour shifts, shoveling coal into the furnaces, maintaining the steam pressure that drove the engines. The work was relentless. Coal consumption exceeded 600 tons per day, and the supply had to be continually transferred from the bunkers to the furnaces. A small fire had ignited in one of the coal bunkers before departure from Southampton, a not uncommon occurrence on steamships. The crew worked to extinguish it, and by the time the ship reached open water, the fire was out, though it had weakened a section of the bulkhead. Thomas Andrews moved through the ship constantly, inspecting, annotating, suggesting improvements. He noted that the coat hooks in the cabins were too small. He observed that the writing room required more tables. He checked the operation of watertight doors, the functioning of electrical systems, the quality of finishes. Andrews embodied a particular type of professional dedication, the craftsman who never ceased refining his work, who saw not the glory but the thousand small imperfections that only he could detect. On Sunday, April 14, the ship was in the middle of the North Atlantic, approximately 1,200 miles east of New York. The weather remained clear and cold. During the day, several wireless messages from other ships reported ice in the vicinity. The Baltic warned of icebergs and field ice ahead. The America transmitted a similar report. The Mesaba sent a detailed message describing a heavy ice field directly in the ship's path. These messages were received by the Marconi operators, but not all were delivered promptly to the bridge. The operators, employees of the Marconi Company rather than the ship's crew, were preoccupied with transmitting passengers' personal messages, a lucrative service that took priority over navigational warnings. Captain Smith posted one ice warning in the chart room and showed another to J. Bruce Ismay, who carried it in his pocket for several hours before returning it. The course was not altered. The standard practice of the era, one followed by virtually all passenger liners, was to maintain speed and course unless ice was sighted directly ahead. Reducing speed was considered unnecessary and detrimental to schedule. The faith in the lookout's ability to spot ice in time to avoid it was nearly absolute. As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. By 7:30 p.m., it had fallen to near freezing. Officers remarked on the cold, and passengers retreated indoors. The sea remained calm, an eerie flatness without even the swell that typically characterizes the open ocean. The night was moonless, but the stars shone with extraordinary brilliance, the Milky Way a luminous band across the black sky. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba transmitted another ice warning, reporting a large field of icebergs and pack ice directly ahead. The message was received by the Titanic's junior wireless operator, Harold Bride, but he was overwhelmed with outgoing passenger messages and did not take it to the bridge. At 10:55 p.m., the nearby ship Californian, stopped and surrounded by ice, attempted to warn the Titanic of the danger. The Californian's wireless operator, interrupted in mid-transmission, received a curt reply from the Titanic's senior operator, Jack Phillips, shut up, I am busy." Phillips continued working on passenger traffic. The Californian's operator, offended, turned off his wireless set and went to bed. In the crow's nest, 40 feet above the forecastle deck, two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, peered into the darkness. They had no binoculars. The pair designated for the crow's nest had been misplaced in Southampton and never replaced. The men relied on their eyes alone. The cold was intense, the air sharp and still. Just before 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw something ahead. A dark mass emerging from the night, a shape that solidified into the contours of an iceberg directly in the ship's path. Fleet struck the crow's nest bell 3 times, the signal for an object ahead, and telephoned the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead," he reported. The message reached First Officer William Murdoch, who was in command of the bridge. Murdoch reacted immediately, ordering hard starboard, which, under the tiller commands still used at the time, meant turning the ship's bow to port or left. Simultaneously, he ordered the engines stopped and then reversed. He also activated the switch to close the watertight doors in the lower decks. The Titanic began to turn, her massive bulk responding slowly to the helm. The iceberg, estimated at 50 to 100 feet high and far larger beneath the waterline, loomed ahead. For nearly 40 seconds, the ship's bow swung to port, and it seemed she might clear the obstacle. But the iceberg slid along the starboard side, a glancing collision that produced a sound variously described as a grinding, scraping, or tearing. Chunks of ice tumbled onto the forward well deck. Passengers in their cabins felt a slight jar, a vibration, or nothing at all. Many did not wake. Below the waterline, the iceberg's submerged spur had opened the hull. The damage extended along approximately 250 feet of the starboard side, not a continuous gash, but a series of separations in the hull plates, widening and compressing the seams between them. Water began pouring into the lowest compartments, the forepeak, the 3 forward holds, and boiler room 6. The rate of flooding varied, but it was inexorable. The ship, designed to remain afloat with 4 compartments breached, now had 6 compromised. The mathematics of buoyancy allowed no uncertainty. The Titanic was doomed. Thomas Andrews descended into the ship's interior within minutes of the collision. He carried no illusions. Moving swiftly through the companionways, he reached the lower decks and assessed the flooding. The mail room, 3 decks below the waterline, was already inundated, clerks struggling to save registered letters from the rising water. In boiler room 6, the sea poured through the breached hull with the force of a river. Boiler room 5 was also flooding, though more slowly. The watertight doors had closed, but the bulkheads did not extend high enough. As the forward compartments filled, the bow would sink lower, and water would spill over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments in sequence, a progressive inundation that could not be stopped. Andrews made his calculations quickly. With 6 compartments flooding, the ship had perhaps an hour, possibly 2. He climbed back to the bridge and reported his findings to Captain Smith. The 2 men understood immediately. The Titanic would sink. There was no possibility of saving her. The question now was how many lives could be saved. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the crew mustered to their stations. He also instructed the wireless operators to begin transmitting distress signals. At 12:15 a.m., 15 minutes after the collision, Jack Phillips tapped out the first call, CQD, the standard distress signal, followed by the ship's position. The message crackled across the ether, reaching ships dozens and hundreds of miles away. The Carpathia, 58 miles to the southeast, received the call and immediately altered course, driving through the night at maximum speed. The Baltic, the Olympic, and other vessels also responded, but they were too far away to arrive in time. The Californian, perhaps 10 miles distant, and the closest ship, did not respond. Her wireless operator was asleep, the equipment turned off. The discipline of the crew in the initial minutes after the collision was remarkable, but the diffusion of information among the passengers was slow and chaotic. Many remained in their cabins, unaware of the severity of the situation. Others emerged onto the decks, curious about the commotion but not alarmed. The ship showed no visible signs of distress. The electric lights continued to burn, the heating system functioned, and the slight list to starboard was barely perceptible. The night remained clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead. It did not feel like an emergency. The crew began the work of loading the lifeboats. The Titanic carried 16 standard wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides, a total capacity of 1,178 people. This was entirely inadequate for the 2,224 souls aboard, passengers and crew combined, yet the number exceeded the legal requirement. British Board of Trade regulations, unchanged since 1894, based lifeboat capacity on a ship's tonnage, not the number of people aboard. The Titanic could legally carry far fewer lifeboats than she had. The regulations reflected an outdated assumption that lifeboats were needed only to ferry passengers to rescue ships, not to hold everyone simultaneously. The Titanic's own design originally included additional lifeboats, enough for all aboard, but the davits were reduced during construction to avoid cluttering the first-class promenade decks. Aesthetics and passenger comfort had trumped safety. The order was given, women and children first. This protocol, rooted in Victorian notions of chivalry, would shape the survival calculus throughout the night. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightler interpreted the order strictly: women and children only, no men unless no women or children remained. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch allowed men to board if space remained after women and children were loaded. The inconsistency created confusion and resentment. The first lifeboat, number 7, was lowered at 12:45 a.m., 45 minutes after the collision. It carried only 28 people, though it could hold 65. Many passengers refused to board, convinced the ship was safer than a small boat on the dark ocean. The crew struggled to persuade them. Stewards knocked on cabin doors, urging passengers to don life jackets and proceed to the boat deck, but they downplayed the danger, not wishing to cause panic. The result was hesitancy, delay, and confusion. In first class, the response varied. Some passengers dressed formally, as if attending a social function. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet famously changed into evening clothes, Guggenheim reportedly saying, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Isidor Straus offered his place in a lifeboat to his wife, Ida, who refused. "I will not be separated from my husband," she said. "As we have lived, so will we die together." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, waiting calmly. John Jacob Astor escorted his pregnant wife, Madeline, to a lifeboat. He asked if he could accompany her, given her condition. Officer Lightler refused. Astor accepted the decision without protest and stepped back. Madeline was loaded into Lifeboat 4, one of the last to leave. Astor remained on deck, smoking a cigarette. Margaret Brown helped load women and children into Lifeboat 6, then reluctantly entered herself. The boat was lowered with only 28 occupants, though it could hold 65. Brown would later argue with the quartermaster in command, insisting they row back to pick up survivors from the water. The quartermaster refused, fearing they would be swamped by desperate swimmers. In second class, Lawrence Beasley found the process more orderly. He and other male passengers assisted women and children into the boats, then waited. When Lifeboat 13 was loading, Beasley was permitted to board because no more women or children were immediately present. The boat descended the side of the ship, and as it reached the water, Lifeboat 15, lowering directly above, nearly crushed them. The crew cut the ropes just in time, and the two boats drifted apart. Third class experienced the greatest difficulty. The gates and barriers that segregated steerage from the upper decks remained locked in the initial confusion. Many third-class passengers, located in the stern and deep in the hull, did not understand the severity of the situation. Language barriers compounded the problem. Many spoke no English and could not comprehend the crew's instructions. When stewards finally began guiding groups of third-class passengers toward the boat deck, the routes were labyrinthine. Some families became lost in the corridors. Others reached locked gates and had no choice but to wait for a crew member to open them. A Swedish passenger, August Wennerstrom, later recounted climbing over barriers and helping women and children navigate the passageways. Groups of young Irish men broke down gates, forcing their way upward. But by the time many third-class passengers reached the boat deck, the lifeboats were gone. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, played throughout the night. They assembled on the boat deck and performed ragtime tunes, waltzes, and hymns, the music carrying across the cold air. Their presence was intended to calm passengers, to provide a sense of normalcy. It achieved that, but it also contributed to the surreal atmosphere, the disconnection between the elegant sounds and the unfolding catastrophe. Thomas Andrews moved through the ship, urging passengers to put on life jackets and board the lifeboats. He entered cabins, roused occupants, and pleaded with them to take the danger seriously. He worked tirelessly, but as the night progressed, he grew quieter. He was last seen standing alone in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting above the fireplace, his life jacket discarded on a nearby table. Captain Smith, his face set and expressionless, oversaw the loading. He gave orders calmly, but witnesses noted the profound sorrow in his eyes. As the end approached, he walked through the wheelhouse and was not seen again. His body was never recovered. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, entered Collapsible C, one of the last boats to leave. His survival would later be scrutinized and condemned. Critics accused him of cowardice, of abandoning the ship while women and children remained aboard. Ismay maintained that the boat was being lowered and no women or children were nearby. The controversy would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the lifeboats pulled away, those aboard watched the Titanic's lights blaze against the darkness. The ship's bow sank deeper, the stern rising gradually out of the water. The angle increased, the forward deck submerged, and water crept toward the bridge. At approximately 2:05 a.m., the lights flickered and went out as the electrical system failed. The ship became a black silhouette against the stars, a shape that defied comprehension. The stern lifted higher, the propellers emerging from the water, the rudder visible against the sky. The angle steepened to 45 degrees, perhaps more. Passengers and crew still aboard struggled to hold on, clinging to railings and fixtures. Many jumped into the freezing water, preferring a quick death by hypothermia to being dragged down with the ship. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill within 15 to 30 minutes. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the ship's structure could no longer withstand the stress. A tremendous roar echoed across the ocean as the forward section separated from the stern, a rupture that occurred just forward of the third funnel. The contents of the ship, boilers, engines, furniture, crockery, coal, cargo crashed forward through the decks with cataclysmic force. The bow section, flooding rapidly, descended into the black water and began its long fall to the ocean floor, 2.5 miles below. The stern section, momentarily relieved of the weight dragging it down, settled back slightly, almost righting itself. For perhaps 30 seconds it floated, the gash in its underside exposed. Then it too began to sink, tilting vertically until it stood nearly perpendicular to the surface. Those still aboard slid down the decks, fell through the air, or clung desperately to any handhold. At 2:20 a.m., the stern section slipped beneath the surface and disappeared. The sound of 1,500 people struggling in the water was described by survivors as the most terrible thing they had ever heard. It was not a scream or a chorus, but a collective moan, a low, continuous cry that rose and fell as individuals lost consciousness and others found the strength to call for help. The lifeboats, some only half filled, floated a few hundred yards away. Most rowed farther from the site, the occupants fearing they would be overwhelmed if they returned. A few voices argued for rescue, but they were overruled. Only Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, returned to the wreck site after waiting for the cries to subside. Lowe pulled 4 people from the water. 1 died shortly after. The temperature of the water ensured that few survived more than 15 minutes. Hypothermia shut down the body's systems swiftly. Victims lost the ability to move, then to think, then to breathe. Most drowned as they lost consciousness and slipped beneath the surface. A very few managed to climb onto overturned collapsible B, which had floated off the deck as the ship sank. 30 men, including 2nd Officer Lightoller, balanced on the upturned hull throughout the remaining hours of the night, standing in water to their knees, shifting their weight to keep the boat from capsizing completely. The lifeboats drifted through the darkness, scattered across several square miles of ocean. The occupants wrapped themselves in blankets and coats, shivering violently. Some boats had lanterns, others had none. The stars provided the only light and the cold was penetrating. Conversations were sparse. Shock and exhaustion silenced most. In some boats, passengers sang hymns or recited prayers. In others, silence prevailed, broken only by the creak of oars and the soft slap of wavelets against the hulls. The experience of those final hours aboard the Titanic cannot be captured by timelines alone. It must be understood through the senses, through the accumulation of details that together form the texture of catastrophe. The disaster unfolded within a precise acoustic environment, a soundscape that evolved as the ship's condition deteriorated. Initially, the dominant sounds were mechanical and human, the hiss of steam venting from the funnels, the shouts of officers directing the crew, the music of the band, the murmur of conversations among passengers. These sounds conveyed urgency, but not yet desperation. They belonged to the realm of the manageable, the controllable. As the bow sank lower, new sounds emerged. The creak and groan of stressed metal, the rumble of objects shifting inside the hull, the splash of water rising through the lower decks. These sounds were less familiar, more ominous. They spoke of forces beyond human authority, the material world asserting its physical laws. Passengers noticed them and felt the first tremors of true fear. The electric lights continued to burn, powered by the engineers' determination to maintain the generators until the last possible moment. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his staff remained at their posts in the engine rooms, standing in water that rose steadily around them, adjusting valves and monitoring systems. They knew they would not survive. Their task was to buy time, to keep the lights on so that passengers could see to reach the lifeboats. Every minute of illumination represented a decision to stay, to serve, to sacrifice. When the lights finally failed, the darkness was absolute. The ship became a void, defined only by silhouette. The stars above offered no practical light, only existential perspective. The ocean, the sky, and the dying vessel merged into a black continuum, and those still aboard were suspended within it, their fates sealed by simple physics. The density of water, the buoyancy of steel, the temperature at which human life ceases. The final breakup produced a sound unlike anything the survivors had heard. It was described as an explosion, a roar, a sound like tearing fabric magnified 1,000 times. It was the sound of rivets shearing, steel plates rupturing, welds failing under impossible loads. It was the sound of a structure designed for a particular set of stresses encountering forces it could not withstand. The breaking of the ship was not a single catastrophic snap, but a cascading series of failures, each weakening the structure further until separation became inevitable. And then, after the stern disappeared, silence, not complete silence. The cries of those in the water prevented that, but the silence of absence, the removal of the ship's presence from the world. The ocean closed over the wreck site as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The stars continued their slow rotation. The cold air remained still. The Titanic, 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg, ceased to exist as a physical object in the human realm and became instead a memory, a trauma, and eventually a symbol. The Carpathia, driving through the night at 17 knots, faster than her designers thought possible, navigated through the same ice field that had doomed the Titanic. Captain Arthur Rostron had ordered every available stoker to the boilers, shut down heating and hot water to divert steam to the engines, and posted extra lookouts. The ship threaded between icebergs in the darkness, a risky passage justified by the distress call. At 4:00 a.m., the Carpathia reached the position given by the Titanic's wireless operators and found lifeboats scattered across the calm sea, their occupants numb with cold and shock. The rescue operation began immediately. The Carpathia's crew lowered rope ladders and sling chairs, hauling survivors aboard. Children were placed in mail sacks and hoisted up. The injured were lifted in the chairs. Those able climbed the ladders, their hands stiff with cold, their movements slow. The Carpathia's passengers, roused from sleep, provided blankets, hot drinks, and cabins. The ship's doctors treated cases of hypothermia and trauma. The process continued through the early morning, boat by boat, until all survivors, 705 in total, were accounted for. The numbers were stark. Of the 2,224 people aboard the Titanic, 1,517 had perished. The survival rate varied dramatically by class and gender. Approximately 97% of first-class women survived. Only 3% of first-class men did. In third class, only 46% of women and 16% of men survived. The pattern reflected the deadly combination of physical barriers, social expectations, and simple geography. First-class passengers, located near the boat deck, had immediate access to the lifeboats. Third-class passengers, deep in the stern, faced locked gates, unfamiliar routes, and insurmountable delays. The crew's casualties were proportionally severe. Of the nearly 900 crew members, more than 600 died, including all the engineers and almost all the musicians. The ship's officers died at a higher rate than first-class male passengers. The women and children first protocol applied less rigorously to crew members, and many, particularly those in the engine and boiler rooms, never had a chance to reach the boat deck before the ship sank. The Carpathia turned toward New York, arriving on the evening of April 18. Tens of thousands of people crowded the waterfront, desperate for news of relatives and friends. The scene was chaotic, emotional, and marked by profound grief. Survivor lists had been transmitted via wireless, but the information was incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Families learned of losses through absence, through names that did not appear on the lists of saved. The press descended immediately. Reporters besieged survivors, seeking accounts, quotes, and details. The story dominated newspapers worldwide, displacing all other news. The scale of the disaster, the prominence of some victims, and the mythic dimensions of the ship itself combined to create a narrative of almost operatic tragedy. Headlines spoke of heroism and cowardice, of the wealthy dying with dignity and the poor trapped below, of a ship unsinkable that sank. Within days, inquiries were announced. In the United States, Senator William Alden Smith convened a Senate subcommittee to investigate the disaster. The hearings, which began on April 19, lasted 18 days and heard testimony from more than 80 witnesses, including J. Bruce Ismay, surviving officers, crew members, and passengers. Smith, a Republican from Michigan with no maritime experience, approached the inquiry with prosecutorial zeal. He sought to determine culpability and to extract lessons that might prevent future disasters. The British Board of Trade launched its own inquiry under Lord Mersey, a retired judge with maritime expertise. The British inquiry, more technical and less theatrical than the American proceedings, examined the ship's design, the regulations governing lifeboat capacity, the wireless procedures, and the actions of Captain Smith and his officers. 36 days of hearings produced thousands of pages of testimony and a final report that apportioned blame and recommended regulatory changes. The inquiries revealed disturbing truths. The inadequacy of the lifeboat capacity was undeniable. The failure to reduce speed despite ice warnings contradicted basic prudence. The Californians' proximity and inaction raised troubling questions. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian testified that his ship had been stopped in ice approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's distress position, but survivors and other witnesses insisted they had seen a ship's lights much closer, perhaps 5 to 10 miles away. Officers aboard the Titanic had fired distress rockets, 8 white flares that should have been visible for miles. The Californian's crew had seen rockets, but dismissed them as company signals or celebration flares. Lord had not been awakened, and the wireless, turned off for the night, did not receive the distress calls. Whether the Californian could have reached the Titanic in time to save more lives remains a matter of historical debate, but the failure to respond represented a profound dereliction. The inquiries also grappled with the behavior of individuals. J. Bruce Ismay's survival became a focal point of moral scrutiny. Critics, including Senator Smith, suggested that Ismay had pressured Captain Smith to maintain speed in order to achieve a faster crossing time and garner favorable publicity for the maiden voyage. Ismay denied this, insisting that operational decisions rested with the captain. Nevertheless, the stigma attached to his survival, a male passenger of authority escaping while women and children died, haunted him. He withdrew from public life, rarely spoke of the disaster, and lived in relative seclusion until his death in 1937. The inquiries concluded with recommendations. Lifeboat capacity must be sufficient for all passengers and crew. Lifeboat drills must be conducted regularly. Wireless communication must be maintained 24 hours a day on passenger vessels. An international ice patrol must be established to monitor iceberg movements in the North Atlantic. Watertight bulkheads must extend higher to ensure compartmentalization remains effective even with the ship listing. The changes were codified in the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914. The human aftermath extended far beyond regulatory reform. Widows and orphans faced sudden poverty. Titanic relief funds were established in Britain and the United States to provide financial assistance, but the compensation varied by class. First-class survivors, many of them wealthy, required little aid. Third-class families, already impoverished, struggled to survive without the breadwinner who had perished. The social inequities that shaped survival aboard the ship persisted in its aftermath. Some survivors spoke openly of their experiences, others never discussed the disaster. Lawrence Beasley published his account, The Loss of the SS Titanic, within months, driven by a sense that the truth must be recorded while memories remained fresh. Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger and historian, wrote his own detailed narrative but died in December 1912, his health shattered by the ordeal. Others carried the trauma silently, refusing interviews, avoiding commemorations, seeking to rebuild lives disrupted by a single night. The Titanic, once an object of steel and ambition, became something else in death, a symbol, a parable, a vessel for meanings that transcended the historical event itself. The disaster entered the cultural imagination with extraordinary speed, and within a generation, the ship sinking had been interpreted as a judgment on hubris, a cautionary tale about the limits of technology, and an allegory for the collapse of the Edwardian social order. The phrase unsinkable haunted the narrative, though it was never an official claim by the White Star Line. Trade publications had described the ship as practically unsinkable due to her watertight compartments, but the qualifier was lost in popular memory. The irony of the sinking, so swift after the maiden voyage's commencement, seemed to demand a moral lesson. Writers and commentators seized on the narrative of pride and punishment, of humanity's arrogance rebuked by nature. The disaster also became a lens through which the era's social tensions were examined. The stark disparities in survival rates confirmed what many already believed, that privilege purchased safety, that class boundaries were enforced even in extremity, and that the rhetoric of equality masked structural inequities. The fact that first-class male passengers survived at a higher rate than third-class children was a statistic that resisted comfortable rationalization. It suggested that the social order, even at the moment of dissolution, maintained its hierarchies. Yet the disaster also produced narratives of heroism and sacrifice that reinforced ideals of duty and nobility. The engineers who stayed at their posts, the band that played until the end, the men who stepped back from the lifeboats to allow women and children to board. These actions were celebrated as evidence of moral grandeur. The women and children first protocol, though inconsistently applied, became enshrined as a principle of maritime conduct, a codification of Victorian gender norms into life and death ethics. The Titanic's memory shaped maritime practices and cultural consciousness throughout the 20th century. The International Ice Patrol, established in 1914, continues to monitor iceberg activity in the North Atlantic, broadcasting warnings to ships. The regulations governing lifeboat capacity, watertight subdivision, and wireless communication have been revised and strengthened repeatedly, each iteration informed by the lessons of 1912. Modern cruise ships carry lifeboats and life rafts sufficient for every person aboard, plus a safety margin. Evacuation drills are mandatory. The industry learned, albeit at tremendous cost. Yet as the decades passed, the Titanic's physical reality receded. The wreck lay undiscovered on the ocean floor, and survivors aged and died. By the 1950s and 1960s, the disaster had become a distant historical event, its emotional immediacy fading. Cultural representations, films, books, songs kept the memory alive, but often simplified or sensationalized the story. The ship became a cinematic set, a backdrop for romance and melodrama, the complexities of the historical event subordinated to narrative convenience. The transformation accelerated with the wreck's discovery in 1985. Dr. Robert Ballard, leading a joint American-French expedition, located the Titanic's remains at a depth of 12,500 feet, approximately 370 miles south-southeast of Newfoundland. The ship had split in two, the bow and stern sections resting approximately 2,000 feet apart, surrounded by a debris field of scattered artifacts, coal, plates, bottles, luggage, personal effects. The images transmitted from the remotely operated vehicles stunned the world. The Titanic, absent for 73 years, was visible again, her hull draped in rusticles, icicle-like formations of rust created by bacteria consuming the iron. The discovery reignited public fascination. Subsequent expeditions recovered thousands of artifacts, which were preserved, catalogued, and displayed in museums. The recovery efforts provoked ethical debates. Critics argued that the wreck was a grave site and should remain undisturbed, that removing artifacts constituted desecration. Proponents countered that preservation served educational purposes and honored the victims by ensuring the disaster would not be forgotten. The tension between memory and exploitation, between reverence and curiosity, has never been fully resolved. The wreck itself is deteriorating. The bacteria that produce the rusticles consume approximately 400 pounds of iron per day. Marine biologists estimate that the ship's structure will collapse entirely within the next few decades, perhaps sooner. The bow section, relatively intact, will likely be the last portion to disintegrate, but eventually, even it will succumb. The Titanic is vanishing a second time, not in a sudden catastrophe, but in a slow biological process, returning to the elements from which it was forged. The physical decay parallels the temporal distance. The last survivor, Milvina Dean, who was 9 weeks old at the time of the sinking and had no memory of the event, died in 2009. With her death, the living connection to the disaster ended. The Titanic now belongs entirely to history, to archives and artifacts, to interpretations and imaginations. The Titanic disaster resists simple summation. It was not a single failure but a cascade, a convergence of decisions, circumstances, and contingencies that together produced catastrophe. The ship was well built by the standards of her time, yet those standards were insufficient. The crew was experienced, yet they operated within a culture that prioritized schedule over caution. The passengers trusted the ship's safety, a trust that was not entirely misplaced, but was nonetheless betrayed by a series of events that fell within the realm of the plausible yet were not anticipated. The iceberg that struck the Titanic was not an anomaly. The North Atlantic in April is filled with icebergs, carved from Greenland's glaciers and carried south by the Labrador Current. Ships encountered them routinely. What made this particular encounter fatal was timing, trajectory, and the peculiar characteristics of the collision. A glancing blow that opened the hull along a length sufficient to doom the ship, but not dramatic enough to immediately alarm passengers. The disaster's lessons are both specific and general. Specifically, it led to improved maritime regulations that have undoubtedly saved lives in the century since. Generally, it stands as a reminder of the limits of human foresight, the fragility of technological systems, and the irreducible uncertainty that accompanies all ventures into environments hostile to human life. The ocean, indifferent to ambition and immune to rhetoric, enforces its own terms. The human cost of the Titanic's sinking cannot be calculated solely in numbers. Each of the 1,517 deaths represented a life interrupted, a future foreclosed, relationships severed. The ripples extended through families and communities for generations. Wives became widows, children became orphans, parents buried sons and daughters. The grief was private and public, immediate and enduring. Among the dead were individuals whose stories deserve particular remembrance. Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect, whose dedication and humility exemplified the best qualities of engineering and craftsmanship, died as his creation sank. Captain Edward J. Smith, a lifetime mariner, went down with his ship, adhering to the tradition of command. The engineers, Joseph Bell, William Farquharson, Arthur Ward, and their colleagues remained at their posts, ensuring that power flowed to the lights and pumps until the water overcame them. Not one engineer survived. The band's members, Wallace Hartley, Roger Bricku, Theodore Brayley, Fred Clark, W.T. Brayley, John Woodward, Georges Crins, and Percy Taylor, played on as the ship sank, their final performance an act of service and courage that has been remembered in countless accounts. Their bodies, recovered days later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, were identified by their instruments still clutched or nearby. Isidore and Ida Strauss died together, refusing separation. Their devotion to each other, maintained until the end, became emblematic of a particular kind of love and loyalty. John Jacob Astor, one of the world's richest men, died in the water after ensuring his pregnant wife reached a lifeboat. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet, dressed in formal attire, faced death with a composure that, whether theatrical or genuine, reflected a particular code of masculine honor. The third-class passengers, whose names were often recorded imperfectly or not at all, died in disproportionate numbers. They were the emigrants, the seekers of new lives, who perished before reaching the destinations they had dreamed of. Their deaths were often unmarked by public commemoration, their stories subsumed into aggregate statistics. Yet each was an individual with hopes, fears, histories, and people who mourned them. The Titanic's legacy is paradoxical. The ship's very fame ensures that the disaster is remembered, but the memory has often been selective, emphasizing certain narratives while marginalizing others. The heroism of the wealthy has been celebrated more than the suffering of the poor. The actions of male passengers have been scrutinized more than the decisions of the ship's owners and designers. The spectacle of the sinking has sometimes overshadowed the preventable nature of the tragedy. What remains, more than a century later, is the persistence of questions. What might have been different if the wireless operator on the Californian had remained at his post, if the lookouts had been given binoculars, if the ship had carried sufficient lifeboats, if the watertight bulkheads had extended higher, if Captain Smith had reduced speed in response to the ice warnings? Each question opens a counterfactual possibility, a branch point where history might have diverged. Yet history did not diverge. The Titanic struck the iceberg, flooded, broke apart, and sank. 1,500 people died in the cold North Atlantic, and 700 survived to carry the memory forward. The ship, once the largest moving object ever built by human hands, descended through 2.5 miles of black water and came to rest on the abyssal plain, where it has lain for more than a century, slowly dissolving into the sediment. The Titanic's story, finally, is not about technology or hubris or class or heroism, though it encompasses all of these. It is about the encounter between human ambition and the indifferent universe, the collision, both literal and metaphorical, between our desires for mastery and the forces that remain beyond our control. The ship was built to connect continents, to transport people in safety and comfort, to embody progress and civilization. It succeeded for 4 days. On the 5th day, it met an obstacle that its design could not overcome, and the dream ended. The sea has kept the Titanic for more than 100 years, and soon it will have consumed her entirely. The steel returned to oxide, the structure collapsed into ruin. But the memory persists, carried forward not in metal, but in words, images, and the consciousness of those who learn the story and recognize in it something essential about the human condition. Our capacity to create wonders, our vulnerability to disaster, and our need to remember both. The night of April 1415, 1912 was clear and cold, the stars brilliant, the ocean calm. The Titanic sailed into it with confidence and disappeared into it with finality. Between those two moments lies a span of hours that continues to resonate, a narrative of ending that has become, paradoxically, a kind of permanence. The ship is gone, but the story remains, told and retold, a fragment of the past that refuses to recede into silence. In the end, the Titanic is a memorial to absence, to the lives that were and are no more, to the ship that was and is no more, to the age that was and is no more. It is a reminder that what we build, however grand, is temporary, and that what we lose, however distant, can still be felt. The cold water of the North Atlantic holds the wreck, and time holds the memory, and we hold both, as long as we choose to remember. The story of the Titanic is a story of human beings confronting mortality in all its dimensions, individual and collective, sudden and inevitable. It is a story that asks what we owe to one another in extremity, what codes govern our conduct when the structures of civilization dissolve, and how we live with the knowledge that safety is always provisional, disaster always possible, and the ocean always waiting. More than a century has passed. The last voices that could say, "I was there," have fallen silent. The steel continues its slow dissolution on the ocean floor. The artifacts rest in museum cases, mute witnesses to a vanished moment. The photographs of passengers, sepia-toned and fragile, show faces that once held futures, now holding only the past. Yet the Titanic endures in memory, in narrative, in the persistent human need to understand how such things happen and what they mean. The disaster was not predestined, but neither was it entirely preventable, given the knowledge, assumptions, and practices of the era. It emerged from the intersection of technology and nature, confidence and chance, hierarchy and circumstance. It revealed truths about the world that have not ceased to be true, that power does not confer immunity, that systems can fail, that the forces we think we have mastered can overwhelm us, and that in the face of such overwhelming, what remains is how we treat one another. The Titanic sailed into the North Atlantic on a maiden voyage that would have no return. The ship carried people who expected to arrive in New York, to disembark, to continue their lives. Most did not. Their voyage ended not at a pier, but in the cold, dark water, or in lifeboats drifting through a night that seemed infinite. The survivors reached New York bearing trauma, loss, and stories that they would carry for the rest of their lives. The dead stayed with the ship, descending into the abyss, their bodies claimed by the ocean or recovered and buried on land, their absences permanent. What we remember of the Titanic is both more and less than what happened. More, because memory adds layers of meaning, interpretation, and myth. Less because the lived experience, the cold, the fear, the noise, the waiting, the moment of understanding that death was near, cannot be fully transmitted across the gulf of time. We reconstruct the event from testimonies, documents, and artifacts, building a narrative that approximates but never captures the reality. The approximation must suffice. The Titanic cannot be restored, the dead cannot be returned, the past cannot be re-entered. What remains possible is remembrance, not sentimentalized or simplified, but as complete and honest as the distance allows. To remember the Titanic is to remember specific people in a specific place at a specific time, confronting circumstances that demanded more than courage, more than technology, more than wealth or status. It demanded the impossible to survive the unsurvivable, and for most, the impossible remained impossible. The ship lies on the ocean floor, its bow section rising from the sediment like a cathedral, its stern section collapsed into ruin, the debris field spreading across the abyssal plain. Submersibles have visited, cameras have documented, artifacts have been recovered. The images show a world without light, without sound as we know it, a realm of pressure and cold where the remnants of human ambition slowly dissolve. The Titanic is returning to the ocean, molecule by molecule, an undoing that mirrors the construction in reverse. In time, nothing of the physical ship will remain. The bacteria will have consumed the iron, the sediment will have covered the traces, and the site will be indistinguishable from the surrounding seabed. The material reality will have vanished entirely. But the story, preserved in words and images, transmitted across generations, will persist as long as there are people to tell it and listen to it. The Titanic will continue to exist as narrative, as symbol, as a point of reference for conversations about technology, inequality, disaster, and memory. This persistence is not trivial. Stories shape how we understand the world and our place in it. The story of the Titanic, told with fidelity to the historical record and respect for those who lived it, serves as more than entertainment or cautionary tale. It is a testament to the lives that were lived and lost, an acknowledgement of suffering and courage, a recognition that even in disaster, people made choices that revealed character, and that those choices and that character deserve to be remembered. The North Atlantic, on a spring night in 1912, was the setting for an encounter between human aspiration and natural force. The Titanic, a product of industrial civilization at its zenith, met an iceberg, a product of geological time and climatic process. The collision lasted seconds. The sinking took hours. The consequences have lasted more than a century. The ship is gone. The people are gone. The age is gone. But the memory remains, a story that continues to be told because it continues to matter, because in the specifics of that night and that ship and those lives, we recognize something universal about hope and hubris, about vulnerability and loss, about the ocean and ourselves. The stars that shone on the night of April 14, 1912, still shine. The ocean that swallowed the Titanic still rolls. The ice still drifts south in the spring. And we still tell the story, bearing witness to an event that none of us experienced, but all of us, in some measure, carry forward. The Titanic is a wound in the historical record, a rupture that has not healed and perhaps should not heal, because the memory of what happened serves a purpose, to remind us that mastery is illusion, that tragedy is possible, that the cost of failure can be measured in human lives, and that how we remember the dead is part of how we honor them. The story ends where it began, in darkness and cold, in the vastness of the Atlantic, in the final moments when the last section of the Titanic slipped beneath the surface and the ocean closed over it. The silence that followed was not an end, but a beginning, the beginning of absence, of loss, of memory, of story. The ship became a ghost, and the ghost became a presence, and the presence has remained, a shadow in the collective consciousness, a reminder that even the mightiest creations are mortal, and that mortality, in the end, is what binds us all.